Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Darren King. It's great to be back with all of you on this chilly end of November day. We're recording the podcast, and it's that time of year where things really start to slow down. At least I hope that they do, wherever you might be, that they slow down a little bit as we wind down the end of the year and reflect on where we have come and where we might be going. This is a seasonal thing that we like to do, and I think it's a good habit to be into, to take some time and reflect and hopefully learn and then grow. There's been a lot going on in the UFO space, Darren, and a lot going on in, I know, both of our lives. The topic continues to see a lot of discussion in the mainstream. There have been recent events that we've been following as well, including things such as the Seoul conference that took place recently, this UFO, UAP, quote unquote, drone flap, whatever that might be, that's happening in the UK at this time. There's a lot going on, and particularly you, speaking of the UK, you just came back from a trip over there, and so I'd love to hear about that. And as far as things on my end, we are in a way kind of closing a chapter that started at the storm 2 months ago. Today we began moving furniture and things back into my in-laws' place because their place had sustained some flooding. And so they're getting back in and starting to unpack and get settled. And that feels good that we're at the end of that trial and starting a new chapter in their life at their house. So it's an exciting time, a lot of energy, a lot of different energy right now, Darren, I feel as well. At least where I'm sitting, a lot of things happening simultaneously. And I know we're going to get into a little bit of that further discussion about simultaneous energy and balancing and reality and all that kind of thing on today's episode. But before we get into all that, I do want to hear about your trip. So tell us what took you over to the other side of the Atlantic, and what were you up to?
Well, I have roots in the UK, so partly it was just to explore those roots. It's been a long time since I had been there, far too long, actually. So partly I just wanted to go back and explore my roots. And I've also found that sometimes removing yourself from your usual context allows you to ask some questions and meditate on some questions differently and in kind of a cleaner way. So that's partly what I wanted to do as well, really using it as a point of reflection to explore some of my roots, but then also meditate on what's coming in the future. So the past and the future kind of being explored. And it was a beautiful experience. I was there for 10 days. It felt like it was the perfect amount of time. That last day walking around prior to taking the tube to Heathrow felt very, very full, but I was ready to get back and enjoy my cabin again and see my cat. So yeah, it was an amazing experience. And like you said, ironically, I was there while these UAP/drone incursions were going on over some of the Air Force bases there. And I remember some people reaching out and saying, oh, what are they talking about there in the media? And of course, the answer is nothing. It's not in mainstream media at all. The only reason I heard about it was because people were talking about it on UFO Twitter and those kinds of things. So, which is ironic and speaks to part of the dynamic that we are experiencing at the moment. But yeah, it was a great trip, and it did allow me to really meditate the way I wanted to on some of what's coming in 2025. I talked to you about some of that privately before we started recording. So mission accomplished in that sense, and I'm looking forward to sort of closing out the year and seeing what's to come.
Yeah, I think we are headed for a very interesting 2025. A lot of change is afoot. The world continues to be in a fairly tumultuous place, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. In fact, I think it's probably going to get a little bit rockier ahead. And I hope that means everyone can navigate that challenge with safety and kind of clear eyes. So it's really difficult to do that sometimes when change is happening rapidly. We can really get be reactionary to that change and kind of turtle up and not want to deal with it. But I hope that we can take that as an opportunity to be more open to change and be more accepting that this is the way things are, and allow that change to be present to us. This is something, Darren, that I've been having to practice more in my own life, just with all the things that have been going on here in Western North Carolina, not only just kind of with the environment and the storm and the rebuilding and all this stuff, but even my own self physically just reacting, finding my body reacting to this stress, instead of doing what I think many of us are programmed to do. And then we're talking more about programming, but we're often programmed to suppress these kinds of feelings and just say, everything's fine. I'm good. Let's keep on going. Instead of doing that, I think I've been working hard to be more present to the feelings and to the energy and to acknowledge that it has been a stressful time and that this is going to pass. It's just, observe and let it flow rather than try to suppress and bottle and confine and hand wave it all away. That's not really doing me any good. So I'm hoping that I'm going to get better at that and accepting kind of where things are, and that allows for some personal growth. Um, so I know we're going to talk about a lot of interesting things on the show today. I think we've got a really good conversation lined up. One of the things that kind of kicks this conversation off is something that we've both and I have heard about recently, and it was an experiment that an individual conducted with DMT and looking at red laser light, looking into red laser light, not directly, but kind of at an angle. You'd never stare at a laser directly; that'd be a bad idea. But under the influence of DMT, looking into this spectrum, this narrow spectrum of red light, kind of portrayed against a wall, and people were doing this, and they were all having a very similar kind of experience when doing this. And the experience being they tend to report seeing what looks like numbers and letters and quote unquote code. And Danny Jones recently did a podcast about this with the individual that conducted these experiments, and a very interesting podcast. Recommend folks check that out. But the discussion kind of quickly gets to, is this sort of the source code of reality? And that kind of hints at a lot of the things that we've heard in the last several years, pointing toward this notion of the simulation hypothesis, that our reality is just a simulation. It's not base reality, quote unquote base reality, whatever that happens to be. But that really opens a lot of interesting questions, and also I think brings to bear a lot of our assumptions about what might be happening. And so as they were talking about the experiment and the community's been reacting to this, and one individual in particular, Dr. Andrew Gallimore, has done experiments with DMT. I think his project is called DMTX, where it's sort of sustained DMT experiences. And so his community asked him to do kind of a reaction video to this podcast. So I watched some of that as well. I thought there's some good points there. And one good point that he brought up is that, yes, it's really interesting that we should look at this and try to figure out what this is. It might be a really insightful discovery, but let's be careful not to kind of jump to a conclusion that it is quote unquote the source code of base reality, right? That we somehow cracked into that, and that's exactly what it means. We're at that point, we're beginning to bring a lot of our own stories, narratives, biases into the equation, to the conversation that may very well not be there. And as I was listening to that, I was thinking a lot about like Jacques Vallée and the work that he's done, where he sort of said, let's not take these stories as kind of like the fantasies we've been told. Let's look at what the experience actually was, and let's kind of focus on that experience itself, and rather than kind of like laying onto it all this other meaning that may not in fact be there. So anyway, very interesting conversation around this set of experiments. And Darren, I want to get your thoughts on it. What is this kind of type of experiment, or these findings or observations? What do they reveal about the nature of reality? Can we say that we might be able to get closer to a base reality? Is there even such a notion as base reality that we should strive to achieve or understand?
Yeah, great questions. And this is something we'll be exploring today, because behind every notion, such as a simulation hypothesis, are all sorts of assumptions that are brought to bear, axiomatic logic that we bring without acknowledging that we're doing that. So yeah, in this particular experiment, it was very interesting, like you say, and they showed some clips from a documentary movie, I guess it's being made, of the experience. And basically what you see is these people on DMT looking sort of sideways, like you say, at this beam of light, this laser light. And within that, people are seeing what looks like code, like actual function equations kind of thing. And so the assumption that's made to some degree is that maybe this is the code that, when run, produces our experience of our reality. So the notion is that some deeper level of reality, maybe some alien intelligence or something, has programmed this reality and it's self-executing. So they talked about in that interview that when we write code, for instance, me with a background as a programmer, I would write code and then some sort of enabling factor would have to execute that code. But the notion here is that just the observer being there basically is what runs the function, and that the function sort of is self-enabling, self-executing. But what we are doing on DMT, at least this is what's implied a little bit, is that we're seeing one level beyond, where rather than just seeing, the wind blowing and the leaves flying through the air and kind of thing, we're actually seeing the function that has ready to play that particular rollout of wind and leaves and that kind of thing. And so again, the implication is that maybe we're going to peer into, if not base reality, then the sort of first starting point of this reality, which is basically code that's waiting to be executed, basically. Now, as you kind of hinted at there, it makes some assumptions about the fact that we are maybe not in base reality ourselves, but we're one step removed from base reality, and that whatever we would come across that seems to be pointing towards some deeper construct, that would be the ultimate construct, and that we're just one step removed. And again, this is partly our hubris again. It was difficult for us to even get to the point where we considered the fact that this might not be base reality. And we'll go into all the reasons today why that may not be the case, and all sorts of empirical reasons and even conscious experience reasons why we would question that. But now that we have, for instance, virtual reality that is quite immersive, we now in our imagination can picture, as immersive and real as this seems, maybe there's a reality one step beyond this. But that's about as far as we usually go. We're not willing to consider that there might be a plethora of nested layers of reality. And of course, it plays into this notion that what reality is, or this particular instance of reality, is basically a simulation run on a computer mainframe somewhere. So some sort of alien intelligence has this really advanced computer system, and that we are basically having the experience of code being run from that layer of reality. So in that sense, it very much plays into our modern notion of virtual reality. And this is something our species is definitely guilty of. We tend to come across some new technological marvel and we go, aha, that must be what's really going on. So we leap to that as an analogy for ultimate reality. So for instance, even when it comes to the UFO phenomenon, we hear people saying, well, is the thing up there in the sky, or are they just projecting a virtual reality? Which again assumes that everything else, the computer I'm speaking to you through, even these bodies that we are inhabiting, are somehow real in a different way than that thing that's in the sky. This is an open question. So yeah, it's interesting to me. I'm glad that it is prompting questions in people's minds, but to me, it's just the opening query in a really long series of queries.
Yeah, that's sort of where I was going to go with that too. And that's this, it surprises people sometimes that you can have a shared experience, right? Oh my gosh, I'm on DMT and I'm looking at a red laser and you're doing it too. And we're both seeing that there's numbers and letters and maybe there's source code there. Isn't that incredible? Maybe that's some sort of revelatory insight. Well, isn't it also incredible that you and I are seeing what we both share at this very moment? We both share a similar environment, similar input, similar content, and we don't question that at all. We basically assume that is already some sort of foundational layer of reality when it's not. And clearly, we've touched on that many times that our senses are giving us a very much a filtered experience of what's taking place in our environment, and it's not to be confused with what the totality of what is actually happening in our environment around us at any time. In fact, it's good that we have that limiting factor, that we wouldn't be able to function as biological creatures if we had full sensory exposure to all of the things that were happening inside our environment. It would basically kind of paralyze us. So it's weird that we're, I don't know, collectively shocked with experiments like this when I think we forget to question some of the other foundational assumptions that we bring to bear on reality to begin with. And as you and I have talked about, and we've covered to some degree on our shows before, we're living in a day and time now where a lot of those assumptions about reality that we've kind of carried with us into the 21st century are really being actively, aggressively, repeatedly challenged by our either our discoveries or our experiences in our shared reality in themselves. And that's really interesting. We're being confronted in a way on a daily basis by confounding factors that are challenging our prior assumptions. And so I wanted you maybe to talk a little about some of those things, like what are some of the pointers that maybe are already revealed to us that the reality that we thought we understood is in fact not what it is at all. Like, what are the signs that are pointing us to the fact that there may be something much more broad than our assumptions about reality to begin with?
Yeah, and even before I go there, I just want to point out something that was actually brought up in that interview that I would recommend that people watch. And that is this notion that this questioning of our model of reality is coming from multiple angles at the same time. And that in itself is fascinating. One of the issues we'll get into is synchronicity in this particular podcast episode. And the implication there is that this is somehow being synchronistically orchestrated, in the sense that we have the UAP disclosure question, which is not just about space aliens from Alpha Centauri, but seems to bring in questions around consciousness and the fundamental role it may play in this. We have shows like the telepathy tapes that we talked about in our last episode, which is creating its own revolution. And people are talking about it everywhere in so many different quarters. Again, not because it's necessarily brand new information, but it's presented in such a in-your-face kind of way that's hard to refute, that people are really wrestling with it. And of course, we still have the implications of the quantum mechanical experiments that were done in the early 20th century that are still being grappled with today that point in some similar directions. For instance, the notion that local realism is not a thing. The implications of that are incredibly profound, and yet most of us are going about getting in our cars, driving to our workplaces and whatnot, assuming spaces are real, assuming that point A and point B actually are a certain distance apart, and I'm a distinct individual, you're a distinct individual. And yet the implications of those experiments are calling all of that into question. But to your point, when we all share that experience at the first layer, we don't think to question it. And we actually assume that because you have a particular experience of looking up and seeing a blue sky that I have, that must actually literally be a blue sky that's objective to the two of us. And all we're doing is both apprehending a reality that is outside of us, rather than perhaps asking the question, could it be the fact that we come from the same ancestors ultimately, mean that our perceptual set is producing that shared experience rather than the thing itself? And furthermore, is there even a division there? Is the subject-object duality something we need to take apart, something that this evidence seems to be suggesting needs to be questioned? So we're going to break this down in numerous ways today, but let's begin with some of the experience we have of our reality that already lends to us the notion that this might be a simulation or a construct. Because let's be honest, most people would not get here by just sitting down and writing philosophical treatises. People get here because they have certain experiences of anomalies or paradoxes, deja vu, that kind of thing, that make them go, maybe this is not quite what it's been presented to be by sort of conventional thinking. So let's begin with limitations of human perception and our understanding of that, and how that has grown our understanding of the limitations, and how that has led us to ask some deeper questions about what might be beyond that perception. But we know now that human senses capture only a narrow band of reality. As an example, visible light is just a fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. We know that other species perceive different spectrums, showing that reality varies depending on the observer. So we are recognizing that there's this kind of marriage between your perceptual set and whatever's out there, if we can even make that distinction, and how the two together really produce the reality you experience. We also know that neuroscience demonstrates that the brain constructs a virtual model of the world based on sensory input. This means that what we experience is not direct reality, but an interpreted version. And actually also got into this in the interview because he made the point, and this was fascinating to me because I make this point in my Essence of Being classes all the time, but it's something we could easily miss if we're not having our attention brought to it. And that is that actually what our brain is usually doing is just showing us cached memory, basically. When we go through a certain routine in the world, there is no need to re-render things because we have so much we can already draw upon. So to, be efficient with resources, we are basically just playing on memory unless something comes into the frame that's so anomalous that our brain goes, wait a second, something's really different here. This could be an existential threat, for instance. I better render this on the fly in real time. But the implication there is that if that's not the case, and most of us following a certain routine do not run into that very often, although very interestingly, UAP are one of those anomalies, then we tend to just be referencing our references. So I talk about this a lot in the classes, that we don't even recognize this distinction anymore, that we often don't experience reality directly. We actually experience our reference point of reality. So when we see a tree, we have all these notions of a tree as a certain kind of organism that grows via photosynthesis and all these things. These are all things we were taught in our science labs, not something that is a direct experience of the tree. So that's where we can start, basically, is just understanding that the limits of human perception play a role here in reality itself. But let me pass it back to you for some thoughts.
Well, I really appreciate this one because recently I've been going through an exercise that I think highlights this idea, and I think anybody can do this, right? So take someone that you spend a lot of time with, right? Whether it be your partner or maybe your child or your dog, or your cat, whatever. So another being that you spend a lot of time with, and wherever you are with that other being, just start observing it and observe it from the mindset of as if you've never seen it before. And that's really hard to do. It's a challenge. It's kind of a meditation in a way, but begin focusing on features and aspects and qualities of that individual that you don't normally focus on. And I think this does begin to break apart those subroutines, those programs that you're talking about. And I find it to be an incredibly valuable meditation, particularly with those that you spend a lot of time with, that you really care about, that that you say that you love, that you feel that you love. Sometimes that love can run on autopilot, and I think we can coast through just our day to day and just take that for granted. But what I found about this exercise is it really brings new life into that relationship. It sort of allows you to view that individual or that animal, whatever it is, as a unique, phenomenal experience that you're not kind of just riding away into a routine that you're just, oh, well, this is insert kind of cardboard cutout of this person who I occupy space with. Now this is a person that I'm going to have to really observe and in a way kind of I think of it as like you're falling in love again with this entity, right? And take that mindset and that approach. And I find it's an easy exercise to do. At least it takes a little bit of work, but you can really get into that space. And when you do it, you are really readily rewarded with instant feedback, because you begin seeing things about this individual that you basically have forgotten, or things that you really hadn't noticed, right? You can go by for many years, if you've in long-term relationships, you can go through those years and just kind of, here we are together. But, as you're staring at this person conducting this exercise, you begin seeing like who they really are in this very moment, and what kind of energy are they giving off, and, what kind of individual are they, and what is your relationship with them? It's an invitation for newness in that dynamic. So I love that you're kind of going there. I think it's really apt to kind of where I am right now. And I've got kids. Many people know that I've got kids. And sometimes with children, it's a little bit easier to kind of observe this because they're growing and they're changing and that kind of thing. But we all had this experience, right? If you've ever had a kid and you went away on a trip and you put them with the grandparents or whatever, and you picked them up, a week or two later, and you look at your children and you're like, wow, did you grow? Like, what happened here? Like, you've changed. And that's because you've broken that habitual routine that you've overlaid onto them. And now you're seeing them in a new light that you kind of hadn't seen a week before, or 2 weeks before, because they're now kind of presenting themselves to you, and they're interrupting that routine that you developed in the meantime. So a great example there, I think, of what you're talking about, and something that I think people can directly apply to their life that can provide immediate feedback and reward in terms of what you're now getting, the level of information that you're now getting back from that experience. It's much more rich and dynamic and meaningful than what you had substituted it for before.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. And I have talked about this in the classes as well, that there's a difference between a relationship, which sounds like a status, an achievement, right? A certain kind of contract, versus relating, which is real time. And it's an ongoing practice, basically. Yes, absolutely. And when we as couples or as friends or as groups of people are all kind of on autopilot, then we should not be surprised that we're not finding anything that new, because we're basically all sharing a collective slumber kind of thing. And furthermore, I would say that even when people think their lives feel kind of dull and repetitive, that's largely because they're running on this cache memory kind of system. And yes, you want to actually proactively engage with reality. And this is something that is a really deep implication of what we're discussing today, that ultimately what we have is a conscious cosmos, I would posit. And therefore, by us playing an active role, like any relationship, as I've discussed before, we will get feedback in return in that relationship. So this is definitely something for people to keep in mind. And it goes against the grain, though, because we are in a society that's all about trying to create familiar forms and not shocking people and not triggering people, right? So what that basically tells us is that our ultimate goal should be to make ourselves comfortable. And nothing is more comfortable in a sense of not being something that's a threat than basically a repeating routine that you know exactly what's going to happen. It's like watching the same movie 1,000 times over. But that's not what we're really here for. And by choosing to expect dynamism and to play our role in the process actually creates that dynamism. So absolutely, I think that's a great point. All right, so the next empirical data we're going to talk about that leans towards this notion that we might be living in a simulation or a construct. And again, we'll break that down a bit more later on, because we don't necessarily mean a computer simulation like is often bandied about in ufology. Next, we have the nature of time and space itself. So first we have Einstein's relativity. So Einstein's theories show that time and space are not absolute, but they are relative to the observer. This undermines the idea of a fixed universal reality. And this notion that your experience of time could be different than mine is already kind of breaking people's brains, and people are still trying to wrestle with that. But we know this is true. And of course, this is often described in the sense that you have two twins. One flies off in a spacecraft that's going really fast, close to the speed of light. They come back and meet their twin on Earth, and the twin on Earth is 80 years old, and the twin that's been on the spacecraft maybe has only aged 5 or 6 years. This is literally what will happen, which shows that there is no fixed progressing of time that happens outside of our experience. Next, we have non-locality. So there's another major implication here that has a role to play in our discussion. So quantum entanglement shows that particles can instantaneously affect one another over vast distances, defying classical notions of localized cause and effect. And I would go one step further and say, now we understand that local realism altogether has been disproven. So we had the first quantum revelations, and then we had a bunch of experiments that were conducted over decades to see if there's some way we could explain this. And what we recognized was no, local realism is not a thing. And like I said a few minutes ago, it's fascinating to me that we carry on our lives not considering what really is this, and is this an illusion kind of thing. Let me turn over to you for some reflections on those particular elements and how they factor in today.
Well, these are, I think, difficult things to wrestle with, right? That local realism isn't a thing, and they directly challenge our taught assumptions about the world, and that's very destabilizing, and not just destabilizing, but it takes time to, in a way, kind of kill the program you've been given and try to adopt this new way of thinking about reality. That things may not objectively be there without you observing them. It's a wild kind of quality to consider. And what does that mean about your experience, about the things that you've taken for granted, about what you understand about things that are in your world, and what does it mean about things like your dreams and your relationships with those dreams, and things like synchronicity? How does that come into play to the equation? I mean, all these things really begin, I think, challenging the way that we think about the causal relationship between I do this and this happens, or I observe this domino falling, it's the following domino, and these are real dominoes that exist in some sort of platonic sense out in reality somewhere. If that's not really true, and if it's all happening kind of in a mental space, in this space, the mind of the observer, what does that mean? And what does that mean about who I am? Am I a fixed kind of thing? Am I objectively real? You can see how this can become pretty challenging to our sense of self, and really kind of shake our foundations of who we think we are and how we relate to each other. Where are those boundaries? Are the boundaries fixed? Like we like tend to think of a table and an object on the table. They have these hard surfaces and they don't really bleed into each other. Are these boundaries set in stone, or are they much more porous than we might like to believe? And does that porous nature of reality, does it affect us at a fundamental level, or are we fundamentally much more connected to these things, quote unquote things, that we observe than we like to think that we are? That we're not as separate from them as we like to think that we might be. And what does that mean to us as individuals and our understanding of reality itself? You can see how you could begin chasing a lot of these questions, and it could lead to some very different ways of understanding the world at large, and how your observation of that world, your participation, that's a great word to use here, your participation in that world is very vital, kind of to what the world actually is. It's a participatory reality. It's not something that just happens to be a fixed quantity, that it just exists out there, separate and individual from who you are, but who you are, in fact, is a part of what that is. And there's an interplay, a participatory relationship between those things that creates, quote unquote, reality. So it's a lot of stuff for me to deal with these questions. Local realism is a big one.
To the point you made there, this is a sort of further implication of quantum entanglement. And this happens with a lot of these notions, that at first you recognize a certain effect that's been observed, and you think about the implications of it. But you still tend to try to find answers that fit within the current model, the prevailing model, until you find there's no way to do that. And again, they did some experiments very methodically, very rigorously in the 20th century to demonstrate that no variable could explain away these results. And that if that was the case, then local realism did not exist, despite our perceived experience of it. And the reason why this is important is because with quantum entanglement, what we were perplexed by was that you could have these two particles, one on one side of the physical cosmos, one on the very opposite side of the physical cosmos. You change the orientation of one, the other one simultaneously changes. And the reason that confounded our notions is because we assumed space was real, distance was real, and therefore there had to be some sort of message being sent from particle A to particle B for it to know to respond. But of course, that is based on this assumption that space is real, that distance is real, it's actually a thing. And the real implication there is that's not true. And of course, again, when we think about our daily lives, getting in our cars and driving into the city, parking, coming back home, knowing that ultimately those distances are not real, then what exactly are we doing? These are some interesting questions that arise. But the underlying implication here is that those two particles are actually one thing, not two things. That the two-ness of them is the illusion. And the reason why one simultaneously changes when you change the other is because they're facets of the same diamond, if you will. So you turn a diamond, it's going to have a refraction of light difference on every different facet. So, of course, this has massive implications for who we are, what this is. If we are all facets of the same one diamond, what does that mean ultimately? What is the real questions we should be asking here? All right, so now we're going to move into some additional elements that we have as part of our perceived experience that themselves point to something deeper, that this might be a construct. And this relates to cognitive biases and psychological illusions. So simple illusions demonstrate how easily our perception can be tricked, revealing that our experience of reality is not always accurate. And these are fascinating. I know you've seen some of these. I've seen some as well. Now that we have social media and we can share these things, people can demonstrably see how an illusion happens right before their eyes and it breaks their brain. And they recognize that somehow what my brain is telling me, the way it's, again, creating a version of reality for me to look at, to experience, is actually not what's fundamentally going on. And the mix-up there between what's really happening and what I'm perceiving happening tells me there's a gap there, that they're not a one-to-one relationship. So this is a fascinating one, because once you see it happen, right, you've probably seen this example. I'm thinking of this one where They're these two objects that look like different colors, but they only look like different colors because the context they're placed within is different. So our brain interprets the color differently. But when you drag one object next to the other, you realize, sure enough, it's the exact same shade of gray. And it breaks your brain because you are so convinced that you saw something other than that just a minute before. And yet you've been able to demonstrate in your own experience that that was an illusion. So, of course, for those of us who are deep thinkers, we ask ourselves, if that is an illusion that I'm being persuaded by, what else might be as well? Another one, of course, is memory distortions. So studies in psychology show that memories are reconstructive and often unreliable, further undermining the notion of an objective reality as experienced through personal recollection. So I want to make a further point here again, because as we've been pointing to here, sometimes there's an initial implication that occurs to us, but sometimes it takes a while and some experience before we're willing to ask those deeper questions. So initially we say, sure enough, with witness reports, for instance, in criminal trials, we know that memory can be faulty. People can misremember. People's biases can end up changing the way they think something happened. But of course, the notion, though, is that there was one reality and then we have a memory of it. But what again, if that thing is being reconstructed and slightly changing every time we engage with it, not just as a memory, but as the reality itself, right? This is the deeper implication here, one that we don't often get to right away.
Yeah, there's one experience I've had not too long ago that reminds me of some of these points. So we took a trip a couple of years ago to the UK and went to Edinburgh and took our kids to this house. I think it was called the House of Illusions, and there are these different illusion places around the world. They're all probably the same company, but it was really, really fascinating. And immediately, once you go through a couple of these illusion stations, you realize you cannot trust your perception at all. Like, I mean, you feel kind of like an idiot, basically, because you go through life going, well, I mean, what can I rely on here in terms of my perceptual understanding of the world? And the fact that we all happen to be able to generally kind of agree on the state of the world and how it appears to be, how it functions, et cetera, and we have a general kind of shared experience of that, that's pretty impressive considering how wrong we often are about what is actually there. And again, here we're getting into these notions where I think we have to confront, that we want there to be a specific object that is persistent, that is the true object. Yet we have very different experiences of whatever that quote unquote object actually is. A good example of this is the hanging cylinder kind of analogy here. So if you have a hanging cylinder and you have light that's projected on this cylinder from two different angles, the surface behind the cylinder will display two different objects. You'll see a circle and you'll also see a square, depending on which way the light is hitting that object. Now, is the cylinder a circle? Is it a square? Is it something more than that? It is. It's something more than that. But your perception of it is going to be limited by your orientation to it. So these are things that I think demonstrate that the world that we perceive is not necessarily the world as it truly is. But also we want to, I think, kind of challenge this notion that there is a world as it truly is that can be ultimately arrived at and achieved. There is, in the sense, this true objective base reality that we can arrive at with just the right amount of knowledge, the right amount of perceptual expansion, that once we get there, all questions answered, problem solved, the equation has been balanced. And I don't think that's the truth. I think that we're finding that our participation, again, using that word, our participation with the experience, in fact, shapes the experience, not just how we understand it, but what it fundamentally really, in fact, is. And so, yeah, these are notions that come into play whenever we're talking about experiments like this DMT experiment or experiences of the NHI. I mean, think about the number of anecdotes that we've heard where people can be in the same place and be observing, quote unquote, the same phenomena, but have a totally radically different experience of what that phenomena is. This is a good illustration of that. And people might come away with that thinking, well, which one of these individuals actually saw the real phenomena? What was it Was it a disc or was it a triangle? Well, what was it actually? And we have the sense that there should be a solid something there, and that maybe just one of these observers got it wrong, or they both got it wrong, but it is something concrete that we could put our hands on. And if we're learning that that may not be something that can be achieved in the way that we've been taught to experience reality, then that absolutely begins to shake the foundations of how we understand the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're describing there is logical positivism, right? So this notion that there's this one fixed reality that we just need to study at a granular enough level and we will understand it. And this has been proven not to be the case. And this is the implications of the quantum experiments, is that these things that we were able to break up into smaller and smaller parts as we got closer and closer to understanding what we thought was base reality, eventually it ends up looking like a field where there are no objects at all, and they seem to take on forms temporarily, but only in participation with our consciousness. So this absolutely challenges our basic understanding. Something else I want to add here before we go into the next section here that relates to this thing about how we want to intentionally go through the world, choosing to look for new things, choosing to interact in new ways. Let's just say that someone had taken some psychedelics at some point, and then at some point, hours later, they went driving. Now, this becomes hypothetically a very interesting experience, because what you end up noticing is your eyes darting all over the road, to the side of the road, even though you're driving down a road you've seen 1,000 times before. The reason why it's a very different experience is because that subtle modulation of your consciousness makes you notice different things, because really what we're experiencing is just a filtered version of reality. And under one modulation of consciousness, if we're driving down the same road over and over again, we basically can rely on our memory, which allows us to do many other things while we're driving, those kinds of things. And suddenly we find we're at work all of a sudden. But this just shows that when our modulation of consciousness is slightly different, we pick up entirely different things. And this is a good reminder of that kind of thing. All right, so the next section has to do with simulated and programmable realities. So this relates to what I talked about earlier, where we are now wrestling with this notion that we might be in some sort of virtual reality or simulation, because we now have that as part of our reality. We've created our own so-called virtual realities, our own simulations. And so we ask ourselves the question, could this actually be a simulation, a virtual reality, under the mainframe of some deeper intelligence kind of thing? So modern VR technology can create highly convincing, and I would say immersive, alternate realities. This suggests that our perception could also be part of a larger quote-unquote program. So, and I want to really emphasize the immersive part here, because once you put on a VR headset, you have the experience of turning your head, and your experience of your reality in front of you turns in accordance with that change of your orientation of your head. Then you get to a point where you end up tricking your brain, again, speaking of these illusions, where your brain starts believing it's real. And you've, of course, everyone's seen these hilarious examples of people who forget they're in a living room and there's a wall in front of them. They start swinging at something and knock something off the wall or whatever, because they've been completely fooled by this immersive reality. And if you think about it, even 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have these kinds of things. And so we had no notion of them. So once our imagination begins to play with these things, we start asking deeper questions about our reality. And as I pointed out to you before, I think for our kids' generation, this is much more intuitive for them to ask this question, could this be a simulation? Because they've grown up with these kinds of games they can play. All right, the next one is the fractal geometry present in nature. So the recursive self-similar patterns in nature suggest a rule-based system, perhaps, that mirrors how simulations might be structured. So if you remember, I'll bring your attention to when I shared that one synchronicity storm I had. If you remember this one point where I talked about being out on my deck, looking down at the leaves that were on my grass in front of my property here, and suddenly everything aligned in a very linear way. Like I saw this geometric pattern that was perfect and was very precise. And so what looked like randomness from one modulation of perception suddenly looked like basically a VR simulation to me. It looked like a holodeck simulation or something, where I was seeing these lasers overlaid on top of the leaves in such a way to show me that this was actually a very precisely drawn up pattern where randomness is the output of that function, if you will. But I remember being completely shocked by that and came away going, this reality is not what we think it is. So in that sense, that did play into this notion almost being computer-like. But again, we'll break down later why that's not the case. But let me pass it on to you in terms of these two different notions, virtual reality and how that has stoked our imagination to ask questions about our experience, and then the fractal nature of reality, right? Because this is fascinating. You look at the fractal structure within a leaf, and you look at the fractal structure within a human lung, for instance, and they look very, very similar. And people like Bernardo Kastrup and others arguing for an idealistic model will say things like, at the largest scale, the cosmos itself looks like the neuronal structure of a human brain. So we see these repeating patterns in nature, which if you were, for instance, going to program something, then for efficiency's sake, you would take the same patterns and use them in these nested recursive kind of ways. And we do indeed see this in our reality itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand why this is a really popular hypothesis, the simulation hypothesis now, because we are on the cusp of essentially mimicking our experience of reality with these kinds of technologies. And we have a lot of popularized fiction that walks us through this. And so it's not a stretch for us to take our own advancements and say, well, geez, what if we applied 100 years of technology to this? And well, if we could do that and imagine what that would look like, how immersive that would feel, well, then maybe we've already done it. Maybe we're in a simulation right now. Maybe it's turtles all the way down. It's nothing but simulations, right? This is something that we're wrestling with right now because of our technological progress. But philosophically, it's not a new idea. It's something that's been around for quite some time, as you know. And this is something about the human mind, I think, and that we're very good at pattern recognition. This gets into sort of the fractal component too. We're very good at pattern recognition and pattern creation, I would say, where we can create order out of chaos. We can bring order to chaotic information, and then make sense of that. Because we're sense making kind of entities. This is one of our primary functions, is to make sense of things, to bring a story to disorder. And so you can see why we would be very into a simulation idea, because it has a very sensical, sort of logical, laid out assumption, right? And so that I think where it becomes difficult is to go from that insight, say, oh yeah, this could be a simulated technological reality, and then say that's actually what it is, right? I think the insight itself is very profound, and it does speak to kind of this deeper nature of reality. But I don't know that it's a technology that is exactly what is a part of it. So we're compressing this into one experience, because technology just happens to be readily available to us right now, and ubiquitous. It's a part of our, we're very comfortable with that. But the fractal component of this, I think, kind of speaks to me to more sort of this, how it's truly more archetypal than it is technological, right? So there's this archetypal pattern that's happening in reality that expresses itself. It kind of projects itself. Whether you can think of it, spatially, whether it's down or up or out or in. It's projected almost holographically. Is the way I think about it. It's projected in a way such that there's almost an archetypal form that then kind of perpetuates, promulgates itself in all aspects of reality around us, and we can tap into that. But let's not confuse tapping into that with something that it is not, right? So seeing code in a laser does not mean that there's some sort of programmer, sitting behind a desk somewhere creating what you're seeing. It's more so that this is a projection of a deeper fundamental kind of structure to reality, and that structure is perceptually dynamic as well. So it's not like it's not saying that the deep layer of reality is a code and just kind of keeps becoming code layer upon layer upon layer, but we're bringing our perceptual meaning layer onto that, and we're seeing code, but it's not really code. It's just this archetypal sort of explosion that kind of continues propagating throughout these layers into themselves. So that's the way I think about it. It's for me, it's more dynamic to think of it that way, and it's less. I don't know. I think I can see the attractiveness of simulation, but it's also very cold to me. It's something that I don't find to be very I don't know, romantically meaningful. It's like you're just I'm part of a program somewhere in some alien, some supercomputer. It feels like that's it's taking kind of our own experiences and just saying, well, it must just be this somewhere else. And I feel like that's a really faulty assumption to make.
Yeah, and this plays into what I've described as the illusion of near pinnacle knowledge. So our species tends to do this, where we always think that whatever we've just discovered is right near the top of complete knowledge. Even to the point where we can look back and laugh at some of our ancestors' mistakes in that regard. So for instance, just prior to the quantum mechanical revelations, pretty much a lot of scientists and politicians and people in the public sphere were going around saying it's basically just dotting I's and crossing T's at this point. We've basically got reality figured out. And then, of course, with the quantum revelations, the rug was pulled out entirely. And this is also interesting because when I think about what you're just describing there, Carl Jung has talked about this. So he'll describe that there's these archetypes, but it's not like a subroutine where you boot up the same archetype. The archetype is like a typology, and then the instance of it would be related to your particular lifetime. So the mother archetype is an archetype that human consciousness shares across the board, and perhaps beyond human consciousness, but we at least know as far as human consciousness goes that this is one of the key archetypes. But how that will actually manifest, the mother figure you will have in your experience will be different than mine, that will share certain traits. Now, this is really fascinating, again, from a programming point of view, because many programmers out there will know that there's this thing called a class, and a class basically has these shared properties that then become instances of those classes, right? So you might, for instance, when you boot up a certain app on your phone, it's the same app I'm running, but you're creating an instance of that code being executed as I'm doing on my phone. The point we want to make, both of us here, is that it's too cold and too limiting to think about this only in terms of code, though, and that kind of thing. And to some degree, the reason why we do this is also underlaid by the fact that we assume that physical reality couldn't be that way. We assume this must be something on top of physical reality, like these aliens are existing in some actual physical space, and they are creating a simulation that we are having the experience within. But it still assumes there is some sort of outside the box actual reality, quote unquote, that is different. And this is the point you were making earlier, partly about, it's all the way up, all the way down. Like, this is the nature of manifest reality, is that to some degree, it's all relative realities. And for some people, that breaks their brain because they want to believe that there must be something outside the simulation. But other than non-form, right, the formless, the seamless, undifferentiated sea of consciousness, everything that takes on form, takes on manifestation, is to some degree a construct. That doesn't mean it's not real. It just means it's relatively real. These are some things you have to wrestle with and really meditate on before they begin to feel real. All right, let's move on to the next element that also plays into this notion that what we might be experiencing is either a construct or a simulation of one kind or another. And this is the mathematical aspect of our reality. So this has become really fascinating to a lot of people. We know that we can basically mirror the functions of reality through mathematical structures. And this raises questions, why would that be the case? Why is it that we can actually model reality on mathematical equations? This again leads some people to go, this sounds like functions in some sort of alien mainframe somewhere. But this is an ongoing question. So the universe appears to be governed by mathematical principles. Some argue this implies a computational, and again, code-like nature underlying our experience of reality. And of course, then we have digital physics. Theory is proposing that space, time, and matter might arise from discrete informational processes, much like bits in a computer. So this has led some people even to get to the point where, say, physicalists that don't want to claim necessarily that the door is real because they recognize it's mostly a field and those kinds of things. But what they'll tend towards is this notion that all that really exists is information, and that the illusion is thinking that it's a wall or a computer or Nathan or whatever, but actually it's just information, abstract information. And this makes some sense to us, but then people like Bernardo Castro have made the point that this is absurd to think these ways, because if you have a description of an object, that's what that is. It's a description of an object that exists. And to take away the object and assume the description of the object is all that's ultimately real is to play this bait and switch that is ultimately absurd. That's his point, that descriptions assume something that is being described. And so what physicalists have tended to do is say, I don't want to lean towards idealism. I don't want to lean towards ultimate mind. So instead, I'll say there's just these informational structures, that there is no space, there is no time ultimately. And if you take away our experience of that manifestation, all you would have is a bunch of information. You'd have a bunch of math, basically. But I think Bernardo's point is well made, that basically that is to put the cart before the horse. What's your take on that particular perspective?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can see, yeah, like you said, I can see the attractiveness of it, that it does seem highly ordered, and that order would be a good excuse to say, well, this is a sort of evidence of a higher mind using this as like a programming language. It's just sort of all ones and zeros, and that's the way it would be. Like the laws, we've heard this, argument as well. The laws of physics are essentially kind of telling us what the sort of run parameters are of the simulation. That these are the limitations of essentially the computer. That it, that has a processing speed limit. That has all these kinds of things. But I think the point that you bring up about the description being confused with the reality is a really valid one. Just because we can describe it doesn't mean that the description is in fact what it is. That the map is the territory. We've used that phrase many times as well. And I think that's a really good one to use. To confuse the map for the territory is a mistake. Trust me, maps are helpful, but they aren't the real landscape. And so getting at that real landscape is really the more rich experience of what's actually there. But the ability that we have to create maps, doesn't mean that we've somehow cracked what that actual landscape is. It's a tool that allows us to kind of navigate that. Mostly unharmed, right? At least we can kind of have rough estimates or guesstimates, expectations of what that territory might have, but it's not the actual experience itself. So yeah, this is an interesting one. It's definitely, I think, more difficult in some ways to articulate, at least for me, but a really valuable insight.
Yeah, another way to think about this too that occurs to me is that some people, for instance, thinking in these terms, that once you understand all of the ways you could describe an object, that you basically have the object, that it's that kind of thinking that leads to the notion that we could one day upload, quote unquote, our consciousness into a computer and make ourselves immortal that way. It assumes that basically this body that is Darren's and that body that is Nathan's, if we could be precise enough about every property describing that person in that body, in that construction of matter, then we would be able to recreate that, and your experience would also spring up from that, which of course relates to the hard problem of consciousness, this assumption that somehow our experience of reality, the fact that we're conscious at all, is a byproduct of the structures and processes of a physical brain. As we know, the hard problem exists because there is no real way to produce conscious experience from this material configuration. And that what we seem to see now is that, if anything, our brains are limiting the greater reality and channeling a sort of filtered version of that reality. And it's more like a transducer than it is a producer or a generator of consciousness. So yes, this notion that somehow you can think about information, and if you could recreate the information, you could recreate the experience, underlies many of the assumptions behind physicalism and the problems therein. All right, the next one is to do with paradoxes and anomalies in our experience. So one we'll begin with is one we've discussed before in this podcast, and it's a collective paradox, and it's the Fermi paradox. So the absence of observed extraterrestrial civilizations in a vast universe leads to questions about whether our perceived universe is a subset of a larger construct. And then we have the fine-tuning problem. The precise constants of the universe that allow life suggest intentionality, as if reality were designed or programmed. So this is another example. These paradoxes, including the Fermi paradox and the fine-tuning we see in our universe that would give rise to life when so many other configurations would not give rise to life, leads some to believe that this is pointing to some sort of programming outside of the construct.
Okay, so the Fermi paradox, I've thought about this a lot recently, and that for me, I've come to a place to, we've talked about many times, and everyone's, I think, used to thinking about this now, that, the universe is so large that, of course, it's teeming with life. But in some ways, like, I don't know if it's a misplaced interest in a way. I think that a different way to think about the universe from a maybe more of an idealist standpoint is that the universe is there for you in a way. Like, we absolutely, could there be life out there? Could there be other entities out there, et cetera? I think that's a given. But the experience of the universe, this is what I'm trying to get to here. The experience of what that is in fact informational, and it is more tailored to us, to you, to the I. And so I kind of think of, I don't stress about the fact that we haven't found it, because in some ways it's sort of like the universe that is ready to be perceived is the universe that is there. And we're not ready to perceive all that, these other facets of this experience, of this reality that are there. We're just not developed enough to understand that. And I don't mean developed from a technological standpoint, maybe developed from a spiritual standpoint. We have lost or have not gained, or maybe both, the capacities to experience what is actually there and what really constitutes life. And the fine tuning problem, absolutely. I heard that a bunch when I was coming up through college, sort of argument for a creator. This was really a pretty intense debate in the late 90s, early 2000s, where, Christians were trying to kind of pull out a very scientific explanation for the reality was. And there was, the divine creator used all of these principles of physics, et cetera, these fine-tuning qualities of reality to create what it is that we see. And so kind of fitting that mythology into a scientific framework is what was, a lot of energy was expelled on that. But you could see why, just through our observation of reality, we say, well, it couldn't be any other way than how it is. And so the way that it is, these very micro adjusted things, if they were one or even multiple decimal points off of the way that they are, well, we aren't going to have the reality at all. Like, none of it exists. It just sort of flies into chaos. But what that suggests to me is not necessarily a creator per se, but that reality sort of requires a kind of order to it. Like, there is a meaning that must exist in reality, and meaning is sort of the foundation, not necessarily that there's this kind of set of variables that somebody's picking from and plugging them into their simulator on their computer, and those variables spit out a universe. I think that it's meaning is what really underlies these relationships, and meaning is what's kind of giving birth to the experience of the universe.
Right. So I have a few thoughts here. Number one, we're seeing how some of these elements dovetail with other elements, or in some ways are subservient to other elements we've already described. And I'll go into that in a second, but let me first address the Fermi paradox. In some ways, if you think about the fact that just from a physicalist point of view, let's take this analogy, because I find the Fermi paradox to be a really weak argument, actually, because we know that the universe is really, really old. We know that some star systems, for instance, have existed for much, much longer than ours. And if we assume, under physicalist notions, under Darwinian assumptions, that life springs into being under the certain particular configuration of elements, and we know the vastness of the universe suggests that there will be plenty of Goldilocks zones where life would come into existence, then based on the differences in the ages of different parts of the cosmos, we would expect that some other intelligences might not only spring into being, but might be much, much older than us and much more developed than we are. That just because we have a certain version of understanding what the universe even is, doesn't mean that's what it ultimately is, number one. But number two, just like the Prime Directive speaks to in Star Trek, certain really advanced civilizations might realize that it's not wise to interfere with a lesser civilization, a younger civilization. You want them to go through the process of learning by their own experience. And so in that sense, you might hide yourselves from those civilizations, and you would certainly have the capacity to do so, because at that point, you're basically engineering space-time itself. So that's the first thing I would say about the Fermi paradox. The second thing, which relates to what we talked about earlier, is that you realize that the fine-tuning problem is not really an issue at all once you realize the whole thing is one thing, right? Because we're talking about universes that exist apart from us and that eventually have the conditions in which we spring into being. But if it's actually all one thing, then our potentiality is already there from the beginning. It is one aspect. It's not many things. It's one thing ultimately. And that this is a major implication that the quantum revelations are pointing to, but we're only slowly getting to. And that is the understanding that because we are part of the equation, we are one of the elements, we tend to look at the thing like a bunch of protons and electrons and those kinds of things. But that's actually an artifact of being within the construct. Outside the construct, it is just one thing. There's just one totality. In fact, I read a really great book recently called The One that was all about basically these non-dual traditions, but getting there from the revelations of quantum physics. So this theoretical physicist basically got here and said that if you really take it to its ultimate end game here, what quantum physics is telling us is that it's all one thing, and that the illusion is the differentiation of these objects and these processes. So in that sense, there is no real issue to get to here. There is no problem with fine-tuning because the whole thing is one thing. All right, now we're going to get into some of the things we've discussed already and we've discussed on previous podcasts, but we can riff on it in a bit more detail here. And this has to do with subjective anomalies in experience. So we've discussed this many times because this is a massive aspect of the UFO phenomenon, high strangeness and all of that. So first one is déjà vu. The sensation of having already experienced something can feel like a glitch, quote unquote, in a system, like when Neo saw the same black cat twice, challenging the linearity of perceived reality. And secondly, we have synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences that defy probability suggest an underlying connectedness or design to events. So one thing I want to say with déjà vu that's really interesting is I was speaking with someone recently, and they had this experience that on the one hand was incredibly traumatic and life-altering, where they were in a car accident. And it's often the case, in the car accident, everything slowed down, time slowed down, and things were moving very, very slowly. So much so that as certain events were coming into being, he also had this awareness, this presence of mind to say that, I know this already. I've seen this before. This is when this happens. And one way to look at that experience of déjà vu is to say somehow this is a glitch in the system. Another way to look at it, I would argue, is around this notion that we, to some degree, author the events of our lives, that outside of this particular construct, outside of this particular manifestational reality, we have an oversoul that is basically co-authoring these experiences and these events so as to provide the catalyst that we learn to transmute energy with and develop soul wisdom. And it's particularly meaningful and emotionally impacting events that strike us this way. So for him, it doesn't surprise me that this life-altering event where his best friend basically died in this accident, where he went on and kept on living, and this friend had helped rescue them from a really difficult point in life. So it's incredibly life-altering. And on one hand, we would look at it from one perspective and just say that's a tragedy, that's shocking and horrible. But something about his experience where he became subtly aware in a split second that he knew this was going to happen helped him understand that it's part of some overarching structure which gives rise to this particular manifestation. So this is an example where not only does déjà vu, I think, point to something, but it points to what we've talked about many times, which is the meaningfully driven nature of reality itself. And that relates to the second one here, synchronicity, because if you remember from the expanding awareness class, I talked about how Carl Jung, along with Pauli, basically did this deep investigation into the nature of reality and determined that causality looks a certain way when you average all the experiences of people. But individually, all you have is synchronicity. And it's not just that some events are synchronous, it's that we, in our awareness, sometimes get to a certain threshold where we recognize it as being a synchronistic event. But actually, underlyingly, everything is synchronistically driven because everything is basically coming into being based on meaningful connections. And even Jacques Vallée has talked about this as well, that the UFO phenomenon might be pointing to this. And this is what high strangeness is when the glitch appears in that sense because it's a particularly meaningful, impacting event. So let me turn over to you for some of your thoughts on déjà vu and synchronicity.
Well, these are both incredibly powerful, and I do agree that they get to the kind of meaningful aspects, this meaning-driven nature of reality, it's kind of fundamental. When I was listening to the podcast that we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, um, Danny, who conducted the experiments, he's talking about, kind of how intuition and his experience of the number 42, the repeatedly synchronistic experience of the number 42, was guiding his journey to kind of creating the experiment that ultimately led to this quote unquote discovery of this code seen in the red laser light. And I found that to be really interesting. And I think he explained it very well and highlighted the challenges that we have in confronting the current model of understanding about how reality works. And he was essentially saying that, I can't bring up these concepts, these intuitions that led to my discovery, because if I explain that I had a dream or I had a synchronistic experience with the number 42, or I plugged in a random number that I found on a sidewalk into a Google search and then found a document that then led me down this pathway to conducting this experiment, like if I explain to you that that's how I arrived at this conclusion, our current scientific, our academy will reject that as a ridiculous way of coming up with an insight into the nature of reality. That it can't actually function that way. That doesn't make any sense. It's nonsensical. There's no causal, real kind of repeatable in a laboratory causal relationship between getting from how he got from observing the 42 on day one to coming up with this experiment later down the road. It's not something that would be reproducible in a lab. And I think this, to me, gets at how we have to kind of flip our model upside down. And this is the real challenge that we're going to have with the phenomena, or wrestling with it in this new kind of dawning of this new reality that we're all kind of going through right now. It's incorporating this into our frameworks, and really maybe incorporating isn't the right word, but we in many ways have to destroy the framework that we've used thus far, and be willing to adopt a brand new one that is inclusive of this more fundamental nature of reality, this meaning level layer that ties it all together. And I think just because, and we've talked about this a little bit before, just because we've developed science that, gives us these incredible powers to do X, Y, Z, doesn't mean that those powers, those descriptions of the way that reality is actually what reality is. It's a approximation of how reality is. And what if we instead can work with reality at that more fundamental layer, absent from our equations, right? And what if, in fact, we're tapped into that layer at all times? We're just not necessarily present to it. And this is something that I personally have experienced, and it is more experiential, I think, than necessarily, taught to you. But it's something that I've experienced directly, where I felt, in a way, I understood the concept without the concept actually having been taught to me in a literal fashion. Like I sat down with a lecture and absorbed the material. Like instead, I tapped into what the knowledge was, and I just had it. It was just there, and that's something that to me is tied into these deja vu experiences, these synchronicity experiences. They're hints at, they're just sort of these surface level disruptions on our normal kind of sea of experience that hint at a deeper meaning level layer that we can tap into and should be tapped into, or at least be more present to than we normally are. Once you're present to it, just like this individual described on the episode, once you become present to it, and Darren, you talked about this a lot, you then see it all over the place. Like it begins just continuing to pop up in all these different wild places. And that, I think, is another clue that this is sort of a more fundamental aspect of reality than what we've been told to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes back to the relational dynamic I mentioned before, that the more we actually stare into the abyss begins to interact with us. But it's not really an abyss, it's the conscious cosmos. And yes, part of the revelations I've experienced, downloads you might call them in another context, have been so granular, where my understanding has been that incredibly fine-tuned details of my life, of my physiology, everything, have a very precise meaning. And this was shocking to me when I experienced this, not because of the general notion, but because of the granularity of it. That it was not just about, sure, the major things that happen to us are synchronistically driven. No, every single thing that happens is synchronistically driven. And that fundamentally, of course, re-enchants reality for you. And it makes you want to pay attention, which increases the vitality of your experience as well. So to me, it all goes hand in hand. All right, we've got a couple more to get to here before the end, so let me move on here. This one relates to the work of Donald Hoffman that we've discussed many times on this podcast, and this has to do with evolutionary biology and fitness over truth. So evolution favors survival, not accurate perception. Our senses and cognition evolve to navigate the environment effectively, not to reveal objective reality. This suggests what we perceive may be more akin to a functional interface than a representation of the quote-unquote truth. So let me pass it on to you. This sounds very familiar. This is Donald Hoffman's work. Go for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of this, and I feel like this is where that intuition also comes strongly into play, that we're kind of evolved to navigate the world, not necessarily how the world really and truly is. In fact, if we saw the world as it truly was, we would have a very difficult time navigating anything at all. It would be a deluge of information that would basically paralyze us from getting anything done. And think about it within our own bodies, right? So we have all these things happening in our own bodies all the time, like all these different chemical reactions and digestion, metabolism, etc. I'm not aware of those things. I don't cognitively am not present to those activities. Sometimes, I get a weird feeling here and there in the body. I'm more present to, how my digestion might be going or whatever. But that stuff's happening all the time, 24/7, and I'm generally just completely unaware of it. And if I were aware of it at all times, it would be difficult for me to function. I would have a hard time getting work done, a hard time interacting with others. I would be constantly observing these microtransactions taking place within my organism, right? And that's a great example just of what we're talking about here, is that there's all of these things that are taking place in the world at large, that happen all the time, all around us, and we're not evolved to experience those realities as they truly are. We're evolved to basically live in a bit of a horse blind. We're just kind of looking at a very narrow slice of the experience, and that allows us to be very good at specific kinds of things. And those specific things allow us to continue propagating and continue surviving. And if we saw all these other things happening, we would be paralyzed, wouldn't be able to propagate, end of species, end of story, right? So it seems very intuitively obvious to me that this is exactly how the world is. And I think once you get this insight, it begins unlocking all of these other kind of components that we've talked about as well. It's an easier kind of on-ramp, I think, to the overall notion that reality is not what we think it is.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that when you think about the implications here, it again shows how even scientists who are supposed to be practicing science, of course, are often riddled with bias without being aware of it. Because one of the assumptions behind many physicalist models is that, sure, we are only seeing a slice of a larger reality. But the assumption has been that the slice we're seeing is accurate, that somehow is a smaller aspect of some larger reality, but it's at least part of that reality. But what Donald Hoffman's work has done is suggest that that's not true at all. That according to his mathematical equations, the chances that we're seeing even a slice of reality is precisely zero. His point, to the point you just made, is that we are seeing an interface. We are experiencing an interface, and we are using something like icons, like on a desktop screen. People have heard me say this many times, but for those who have not heard it, let me just say it one more time. We are interacting in the world through icons. So who Nathan is as a conscious being is very different than what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a translation to something I can make sense of. And Nathan, as he truly exists, might be nothing like this. But this icon helps me interact in the same way that an avatar in a video game allows me to move around in this binary code. So this is really important to realize. It's not just that we're seeing a subset of a large reality, but that even what we're perceiving in that subset is translated into icons and an interface. And therefore, that has led people like Donald Hoffman to say, the reason why the Fermi paradox exists from his point of view is that we're looking in our own interface for beings that exist outside of that interface, that other beings wouldn't share that evolutionary interface. So of course we wouldn't find them there. Now, the fact that we do know the UFO phenomenon exists suggests that some of them know how to interact with our interface, know how to interact with us in such a way that their icons populate onto our screen, which is fascinating in itself, but suggests there's much more beyond that as well. All right, we're down to the final one, and then we can do some final riffing after that. But this has to do with empirical observations of mystical experiences. So first of all, let's discuss psychedelic research. Studies reveal that altered states of consciousness can produce perceptions of realms or dimensions that feel more real than ordinary reality. We talked about that Danny Jones interview. They went into that a lot. This is very, very common. We also have meditative states. So without needing to take any kind of substance, just putting yourself in a different modulation through your own intention. Empirical research on meditation shows that practitioners often report experiencing a dissolution of the ego and the material world, revealing deeper, more fundamental states of awareness. And I would say fundamental states of being. So let me hand it off to you. Mystical experience and what it suggests about the ultimate nature of reality.
Well, I think we are the benefactors of centuries of mystical experience that have gotten us to where we are now. And it just so happens to be that where we are now, we tend to want to disregard them. And it's kind of bizarre in a way that we've allowed ourselves to benefit from our ancestors, who I think have tapped into these states of reality much more frequently and more in a more rich way than we have. I mean, let's talk about that for just a quick second. You know, we have the popularity of psychedelics today, right? And it's just kind of viewed very recreationally by many individuals. You know, just do this and have this wild experience, man, it's crazy. But think about how that psychoactive substance was used historically. It was used in a much more ritualistic fashion. And I think that's because our ancestors really understood that there was this, reverence for that experience, that ritualizing the experience brought deeper levels of meaning to it. And, I think getting into the mystical experience and allowing that to reveal these more fundamental aspects of reality is in some ways kind of a shortcut, a very meaningful shortcut to take. But we need to be more present to, and we need to acknowledge that they have genuine insights into how the world actually is. I think we tend to, kind of brush those things off as mere entertainments. But what you hear time and time again, people that practice these and with intentionality, and I know, you and I both had experiences in this regard. If you go into it with intentionality, you don't just come out with a fun story. You come out with something that literally has changed your life and has given you an insight that you did not have before. It has taught you something about the way the world actually is. And in some cases has even shown you information about what will happen. That's another sort of thing we could talk about a little bit if we had more time. But that's this sort of temporal quality of reality, that information about what we call our future is, in fact, kind of there all the time. The past, the present, the future coexist in one moment. And the mystical experience often speaks to that, this sort of oneness, this dissolving of that separation, the dissolving of self, the dissolving of sequence of causality, and that feeling of oneness. And that's something that I think, very much matches up with the way that reality tends to be.
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. One is that, to your point, to develop that a little further, both with meditative states and psychedelic states, what we find is actually people experience more of reality. So as you pointed to, sometimes when people think about doing quote unquote drugs, they want to escape reality. But what psychedelics do, especially when you have the right intention, as well as meditative states, what they do is they actually deliver us into a deeper experience of reality, where basically the normal default mode goes offline. So yes, we can take certain substances that help that happen. And just through our own practices and our intention through meditation, we can create this experience where basically the brain and how it modulates consciousness goes offline because we're not using it. And then we basically expand into the totality, which is ultimately one thing, not a plurality of objects. So in that sense, it's not surprising that what people come back saying they experienced was oneness, was this undifferentiated sea of consciousness. And yes, space and time and everything dissolve. The point I think I'd want to make as a final comment here is that we shouldn't take from this that this is not real, and should I therefore not even try, and why am I even here, and does anything mean anything? I think it's actually profoundly the opposite, that because it's simulations or constructs, if you will, manifestations of this formless realm, all the way up and all the way down, and all we take with us across these different constructs is the deep wisdom that's sort of imprinted at a soul level, even at an oversoul level. Because of that, I would say that we should try to take the marrow out of the bone, if you will, of our experiences, that we want to be more aware, more aligned, more present, not just on default mode, not just on automatic mode, not just cruising through life, relying on cached memory, that we will get out of it what we put into it. And furthermore, I would say, again, from that oversoul level, all sorts of evidence, mystically, and other traditions point to this as well, that there's a sense that we actually had a role to play outside of this construct, and some larger fractal version of ourselves at the oversoul level is to some degree co-authoring ahead of time, if you will, although again, that's only a partial way of understanding it, the events of our lives, so that we will have these opportunities to transmute energy and grow in soul wisdom. And the final point I'll make, and I mentioned this to you in the beginning, this was fascinating to me that this came up as one of the revelations that came out of the telepathy tapes that we discussed last time. The reason why it was fascinating is because this is one of the downloads I had last year, which was this really strong sense, and not a teaching, but a direct experience of the fact that these different lifetimes, these different incarnations, these different constructs, if you will, that we embody, not only happen simultaneously. Again, it gets tricky using temporal language, but it's easier to think about it as simultaneous. That's a better representation than one after another. Not only does that happen, but that each of those constructs impact each other. That the decisions we make here, actions we take, even thoughts we entertain, not only impact this life, but impact these other incarnations we take up as well. So to me, that's an invitation to be more involved, to be more online, and to really suck the marrow out of life.
Little said. I'm thinking here as well that our experience of life is not just a useful fiction. And unfortunately, that's what many of us have been taught, is that the way we experience life and the meaning that we derive from life, and the deeper qualities that we enjoy about the lived experience, we're told by kind of the scientific narrative, the materialist narrative, that that's just a useful fiction. It's not really a thing that's actually happening. That's just these interactions of these molecules in your body, and it's nothing more. And I think that is incredibly unfortunate, and also betrays our lived experience. And lived experience is all we fundamentally have, right? So we tend to mock that as, oh, I can't believe you're trusting your gut or your intuition, or you had a sense that this was going to happen, or you had a vision in your dream and that impacted the discovery that you just made. Well, isn't that just crazy? That's ridiculous. That's just chemical processes taking place inside your body. I mean, what an awful way to reduce the human experience into absolutely meaninglessness. And is it then any surprise that we have a world today that we live in where meaning is something that many of us lack, and we search for and hunger for? Well, we've been raised to believe that there isn't such a thing. And so I think what we're kind of asking folks to do is to lean into the experience and really be present to that experience, and not kind of hand wave it away as, well, this is just the way life is. It's a program we're all kind of running on autopilot, and that's all there is to it. But really be present to what's taking place around you, because there's this incredibly rich, dynamic, informational field that we find ourselves in, and not as a separate thing from, but part of it. If we are part of it, just like the wave is a part of the ocean. And so we're an expression of that reality. And so how can we be present to that fundamental movement, and then allow that to bring forth even greater meaning, greater expression, from that sea of reality. I think that it's available to us, and many of these things that we've talked about, psychedelics, et cetera, just kind of bring that to us front and center. But it's there for us anytime we want it, right? And that's something that I think, Darren, your Essence of Being class certainly taught me, and that's, it is something that we can cultivate, just like a discipline, a practice. We can get better at doing that. The telepathy tapes talks about this kind of thing as well. That these are abilities that we have. We've just let them atrophy. So why not kind of lean into that, give them a shot, and then be amazed at what you find, because I think you're going to be immediately rewarded with that. So, Darren, any other closing thoughts?
Just really underline that emphasis around engaging. That one thing I've really tried to make clear in my classes and has become clearer to me over time is that the only thing in our way is ourselves, is the obstacles we put in our way. And unfortunately, we exist in a society where all of these obfuscations, these ways that we don't operate under radical transparency, prevent us from having the direct relationship with life that's available for us. And so it's really about not trying to get somewhere so much as it is realizing, understanding again that space and time are not ultimately real, that all we want to do is clean the mirror of all this grime so that we can reflect everything, because that's what we ultimately most fundamentally are. And so that invitation is before us. And as you pointed to, there are tools we can use, there are practices we can follow to actually improve this in our experience, to actually fundamentally change how we experience reality. And because of the relational dynamic, it also in turn then relates to us differently, and the dynamism only grows. So my encouragement to everyone would be to definitely lean in.
Cheers to that. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits, and we'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.